So welcome everybody to the History Center. My name is Cheyenne and I am the public program coordinator here. And I want to welcome everyone here in person and everyone joining us virtually. Thank you so much for being here. We'll run through the program today, should take about 45 minutes, and then there will be some time at the end for questions. We'll wrap the program up for the sake of our online audience, and then at the very end, if anyone has any stories they want to share, I know a lot of people love sharing stories, so we'll have some time for that too once we wrap up the online audience. So and if you are online and you have any questions, my boss Callie is actually behind the computer today, so you can just type those into the chat and she will relay those questions to me. So yeah, thank you so much for being here. I am actually originally from Plant City, Florida, and I've been in Orlando now for about 10 years, but my time in Plant City, I lived on what I now have learned is considered a homestead, and my family grew a lot of their own plants or vegetables and fruits, and we would trade with our neighbors who had cows and chickens, horses. So they had a lot of property. We just had a couple of acres. They had like 40 acres plus next to us. But this with, watching Westerns, growing up with my great-grandpa, I just have such a deep appreciation for the cow culture here and for agriculture in Florida. Florida's a really great place for it. And I'm going to show you guys this photo here. This is a painting by an artist. His name is Frederick Remington, and he was a painter during the 19th century. And so here we have this wonderful depiction of these cowboys. They're riding their horses, and this is a pretty fierce scene that we have. So they are in the middle of all of this action. There's a man falling off of his horse. They have their lassos trying to get everything under control. So by a show of hands in here, and if you're online, you can maybe just put a little hand emoji in the chat. When I say a Florida cowboy, how many of you picture a cowboy like the one that you see here? Someone really fearsome and strong and always down for the action. How many of you? Show of hands. Okay, we got some hands raised. I love that. Now, by show of hands, how many of you maybe picture a Florida cowboy more along the lines of like a Beverly Hillbilly type figure? Yeah? Well, today I am arguing that this might be because of a long-standing smear campaign that started in August of 1895 by this artist, Frederick Remington. So, who is Frederick Remington? Well, he was born in New York in 1861, which is at the very start of the Civil War. So I kind of wonder if part of his upbringing during this tumultuous time in our history might contribute to his obsession with the West and with cowboys and this really like rough and tough way of life. So he was never a cowboy himself, but he really was obsessed with the mythos of the Wild, Wild West. And he would travel frequently out west to document these cowboy scenes, and they would be published nationwide in this publication called Harper's Weekly. So he'd go out, he'd paint some paintings, he'd do a write-up of what he saw and what he thought of these cowboys, and he would publish them. Well, during this time, Florida is starting to be developed. I mean, we're in 1895 when Frederick Remington visits Florida, and so Florida had only been a U.S. state for about 50 years at this point, and he gets word that there are cowboys in Florida. And so he wants to come down and see what all of this Hubaloo, whatever, is about here in Florida. So he comes down to Arcadia to learn about our cow culture. And this is the piece that he makes. This is kind of different than the ones that he was making out west, which you can see here, the comparison of the two. We have a cracker cowboy, his depiction of a Florida cowboy, versus his depiction of these Western cowboys. And in his write-up in the Harper's Weekly of a cracker cowboy, this is what he had to say. Two very emaciated Texas ponies pattered down the street bearing wild-looking individuals whose hanging hair and drooping hats and generally bedraggled appearance would remind you at once of the Spanish moss which hangs so helplessly to the limbs of the oaks out in the swamps. There was none of the bilious fierceness and rearing plunge which I had associated with my friends out west. The only things they did, which were conventional, were to tie their ponies up by the head in brutal disregard and then get drunk in about 15 minutes. So that didn't paint our cow culture in a really great light, and people were rightfully upset. And if you know anything about Florida lore, you've probably heard this name before, but the person that he met and made this painting of is none other than Bone Mizell. We will get into the Mizels a little bit later, but yeah, if you've been around Florida, we have stuff on the Mizels here, even on our 4th floor exhibit. So we can see how he's comparing these two types of cowboys at this time. And again, people were upset. The Pensacola News responded, and they said, there was no occasion to repeat the offense by the publication of Frederick Remington's libellous picture of the cracker cowboys of Florida. People were not happy. And again, Florida has a really long cattle culture, so this makes sense. I mean, our cattle culture dates back centuries, even before the Spanish first introduced cattle in the 16th century. So before the Spanish were here, I mean, they introduced horses, cattle, and oranges, but there are native people that live here in Florida and were here before the Spanish, and they were ranching before the Spanish got here. We have wild buffalo in Florida, and if you've been to Payne's Prairie, you might have seen some of those buffalo, but they were out here, and so the native population were ranching those buffalo. And then when the Spanish brought their cattle here, they started to ranch that cattle. And eventually European and African descendants developed their own ranches and found a lot of independence through these cash cows. And today Florida is actually the 9th biggest producer of beef cattle. But before we continue, we have to establish something. Here in Florida, we call them cowmen and not cowboys. So let's get into why that might be. I mean, technically both drove cattle to the market, so what is the difference? Well, the term cowboy was actually coined in the 1700s in the Carolinas and was used to describe black cow handlers, but it gained a lot of popularity, and so people started to adopt being called a cowboy. But as Florida developed, we started to call them cowmen, and in these two photos, you can see some of the even physical differences between cowmen and cowboys. So on the left, we have a Texas rancher who we would call a cowboy, and they would ride on dry, open land, and they could dismount and use these long ropes called lassos to catch stray cattle. And they also had these knee-high boots that were made from some buffalo hide to protect their legs. And here in Florida, our herders called cowmen, as you know, faced a lot of scrub and swamp, and they needed these far-reaching whips called bull whips to scare up the cows and get them back on the trail. People have asked me, were they hitting the cows with the bull whips? And no, the sound from these whips would corral the cows back into where they needed to be. And there's a lot of lore around how did we get the word cracker, and one of them is by the sound of the whip, the bull whip, being flung, and it would break the sound barrier, and that iconic sound is how we got the word cracker. So we can look at these photos and see the differences between the cowboys and the cowmen. And in this slide here, the top left photo shows what a cracker cow would look like. So when you're looking at this cracker cow, they are really scrawny. They don't look too juicy. And during the Spanish-American War, a lot of soldiers joked that if you ate enough of this cow, that you yourself would become bulletproof. That's how tough the meat was. So these cows didn't do too well here in the U.S. People didn't like how tough the meat was, but we'll discuss this more later. There was a huge market for these cows in Cuba and in the Caribbean. So a lot of these cows became good money-making exports when they would be delivered to the Caribbean. And below that photo of a cow, we have a cowman on his marsh tacky. And a marsh tacky is just a really strong horse that's meant for navigating through the pretty muddy conditions of Florida. And next to that photo of the cowman on his marsh tacky, we have a citrus crate label of this cowman. And cowboy and cowman throughout the presentation you'll see are kind of used interchangeably, but here we have this cowman on his Bronco and a nice little palm tree in the background. So very tropical cowboy vibes going on. And then above that citrus crate label, we have a photo that many of you may recognize as the land that these cowmen were having to corral their cows through. So again, as you can see, if someone were to use a lasso, they might get caught on a lot of these trees. It's swampy lands and there's a lot of pine, so it wasn't really good for that, but great for the bullwhip. Now, in 1521, we have the first domestic cattle that arrived in Florida. And like I said, they were brought here by Spanish conquistadors that were hoping to take land from the Calusa, who are ancestors of the modern Seminole tribe of Florida. But the Spanish left behind their supplies, including cattle, after the Calusa drove that first colonization attempt back to the sea. And here below the photo of the cows and the horses, we have some Spanish brands. So before 1949's fence law passed, a lot of these animals, well, they were just free roam. So the way that you knew which cow or which horse belonged to who is with these brands. So we have an example of some of these Spanish brands here. And many of these Spanish expeditions to Florida included African and Afro-Caribbean people, both free and enslaved, who brought with them generations of knowledge in cattle herding and animal husbandry. Early African cattlemen would later help and shape communities such as Fort Mose, which you see here. And Fort Mose is right next to St. Augustine. If you've been over there, you might have seen Fort Mose before. And Fort Mose was the first legally sanctioned free black settlement in what is now the United States. One of the men that you see here, he is named Francisco Menendez, and he was born in West Africa and became enslaved under the British colonies in the Carolinas. But he escaped to Spanish Florida, where he found freedom with his wife, Ana Maria de Escobar. And during this time, Spain had control of Florida and was telling a lot of the people who were enslaved in the Carolinas and surrounding areas that if you move to Florida and you convert to Catholicism or you join our military, you can find freedom and you can have your own place in Fort Mose for helping us out. So they were trying to weaken the British colonies and get some more people down to Florida to build up their military. And these cattle that you see are modern day ancestors of the Texas Longhorn, and they were really prized for their hardiness and resistance to a lot of parasites that the breed had developed living here in Florida. I read that at one point, cattle did not exist below Kissimmee because the mosquitoes would just give them diseases and kind of stop them in their tracks, if you will. So they developed a lot of this hardiness through living here and quickly spread across North America and became a bunch of different breeds. And cattle like this helped to create a lot of the state's economy through that boom of cattle in the 19th century. So by the 18th century, there were many dynamic relationships on the wild frontier of what we now know as Florida. Native Americans, Spanish, and English settlers in Florida battled over control of the cattle and the land that they grazed on. And the success of Seminole towns, farms, and pasture lands in South Florida caught the eye of farmers and plantation owners in the southern United States. And in 1812, we have that first attempt to seize Florida, which jump-started the 40-year war between the Seminole tribe and the U.S. government. So here, this photo is of Ahaya, and he was known as the Cow Keeper, and he was the first chief of the Alachua band of the Seminole tribe and took territorial control of modern-day Payne's Prairie and an abandoned cattle ranch in the early 1700s. Ahaya and his people, they established Cuscowella, which became the first established American town in the Florida Territory, known under its current name as Micanopy. I hope that I pronounced that right. I've heard a couple different pronunciations. The Seminoles and the U.S. battled over the cattle population until European settlers displaced the native people. And a little other fun fact that I found while reading about Ahaya is that he promised that through his life he would kill 100 Spaniards. However, on his deathbed, his biggest regret was that he only killed 86 Spaniards. Yeah. Ahaya's successor was his nephew Payne, and he established a much more diplomatic relationship with the government, and the area around Alachua became known as Payne's Prairie. And by the end of the 18th century, the Seminole had gone from fighting the Spanish to defend their stock to becoming the primary supplier of beef to the Spanish colonies. And a lot of these major ranching operations in Florida are still led today by the Seminole tribe. Now, the second generation to settle in Florida after the Spanish were pioneers who traveled south during the period between the American Revolution and the Civil War. And in 1842, the Armed Occupation Act offered many new settlers a chance to get 160 acres by defending their land for 5 years. So let's just set the scene for a second. It is 1842. Florida is in the middle of a war. And you hear these stories of you want to go to a place where you hear stories of a war going on, people trying to chase out the pioneers that were moving down here. There's panthers, alligators, mosquitoes, bears, wolves. There's a lot happening here. So I feel like the people that first moved here had to have been crazy. I could not imagine wanting to do that. And that first settler who moved here was Aaron Jernigan, and he had 700 cattle with him, and he established a log home on Lake Holden. And this photo here is of Lake Holden around 1883. But in 1845, Florida became a state, and Aaron was elected as our first state representative. Now, here we have a photo of our cowman riding across this trail. This is the Florida Cracker Trail, and it's 120 miles long, and it goes from Bradenton to Fort Pierce to Bradenton, back and forth. And these cattlemen would ride their horses down this trail with all of their cows. There would be cow camps set up along the trail. And the peak time to deliver cattle to the ports was July through August. So if you know anything about Florida, you know that is our hurricane season. Yay! So these cattlemen were dealing with mosquitoes, a war, and all of these animals, and now also hurricanes. So when we're thinking about the early cattlemen of Florida, they really were these rugged men and women who were trying to make some money, and they had a lot of stories to tell. And people still do ride the Florida Cracker Trail. It is still there, and every year there's actually a 9-day trip where people saddle up and they'll ride from Bradenton to Fort Pierce. And it concludes with a parade through Fort Pierce. And there's also the oldest commercial establishment in Fort Pierce. It was established in 1882 as a trading post between the Seminole tribes, the planters, crackers, and sailors. It's still there today, so you can also visit that when you're on that Florida Cracker Trail. And I also put a photo of a land remembered on this slide too, because a lot of these stories of what life was like on the Florida Cracker Trail can be read in that book. If you have not read that book, it's pretty good. So I believe everyone in here might know Jacob Summerlin. He is dubbed the Cracker King of Florida, and at one point, he was one of the wealthiest men in Florida. So as we move into this next section, I really want to highlight some of these iconic figures who might have had their own stories along this Florida Cracker Trail and really helped develop the cattle culture here in Central Florida. And he made his fortune cow hunting in the Kissimmee and Peace River areas. And eventually he expanded his empire to hire other cow hunters that would traverse these wild woods of Florida to catch and mark the cattle as his own. And like we said, cow hunters would be gone for weeks at a time, traveling from cow camp to cow camp. And these cow camps consisted of small chickees with a couple of cow pens, usually built in like an oak hammock. You can see the structure in the top middle photo. That is a historical picture of structures that were on the property of Lake Kissimmee State Park prior to the state ownership. They no longer exist there at the park. And like we've said, each cow camp was roughly a day's ride apart, and the hunters would spend a couple of days in the area gathering cows. And once these cow hunters had enough cows, they would head to the markets where they would sell the cows at the ports. And a lot of times these cow hunters would just have them, maybe a friend that they're riding with, and some dogs that were trained to find these cows in the marshes and the swamps and pine lands and corral them. A lot of times they were leopard cur dogs. That's what I read. And back to Bone Mizell, another infamous figure in Florida's cowman history. This is the man that Frederick Remington met when he came down to Florida and made that statement about the Florida cowmen being a bunch of scraggly drunkards. Cowmen of Florida were in a league of their own, and they could not properly be compared to cowboys of the West. They faced a lot of different challenges, used different tools, and grew the cattle industry in different ways. Now, Bone was known for sleeping outside, drinking whiskey, and occasionally enjoying some leisure time in bordellos. But despite his rough ways, he had a special talent for recognizing and remembering cattle and brands. And at one time, he was actually the ranch foreman for a lot of cattle for Judge Ziba King, who was one of the largest cattle owners in the state. But eventually, Bone did pass away in a way that was very fitting for his character. They said that he passed away with his boots off, sleeping outside, and the undertaker entered his cause of death as moonshine, went to sleep and didn't wake up. While Bone resided in Manatee County, he was related to Sheriff Mizell, who lived in Orange County and was the first sheriff killed in his line of duty in the 1870 Barber-Mizell feud. 7 people were confirmed dead as part of that feud. However, there are suspected more victims of the feud that are undocumented. And one of the people who passed was part of the Yates family, one of Orlando's first settlers. So here we have a photo of the Yates brothers on Main Street, which is now magnolia that runs behind the museum, and we can see the old armory building in the background. The Yates family got their start in Orlando in the 1850s, where on some deeds we found that they claimed to have owned the parcel of land you see on the screen named Orlando's Mystery Parcel. They did sell 1 acre of this land to Jacob Summerlin, and the Yates family owned 200 head of cattle, and they had about 4 children, according to the records in 1853. In 1878, the family sold about 4 acres, more or less, to the County of Orange, which later became known as Heritage Square, that we are on today. And in 1861, during the Civil War, the Yates family moved further into Orange County's wilderness to keep their cattle hidden from Union poachers that were wanting to cut off the Confederate food supplies. Now, when they moved into the cypress swamps around Shingle Creek, and then again to Fort Christmas, where one of their houses from 1890 still stands today. In 1870, one of the boys, Needham, was shot and killed during the 1870 Barber-Mizell feud. He claimed to be the one to shoot the sheriff because the Yates and family, they were allies with the Barbers, but this lie cost him his life because he was not the one to shoot the sheriff. Now, as we have seen, Orlando was and is a city full of characters, and while beef has always been a really big market in Florida, Orlando has more so been known for its dairy throughout history. The dairy industry in Orlando can be traced back to one woman known as Amanda Ford. She was originally from Ohio and sought a healthier life, so she came to Orlando, where she purchased a chunk of vacant land in 1882 where orange groves once sat. The orange grove was said to be over 30 years old, and she wanted to build a home on this property, so she ordered only the finest materials to be delivered from Ohio via train to Orlando. And included in this carpentry order was a cow. At the time, there were no cows which produced milk in Orlando. There was only beef cattle, so this was a pretty hot commodity at the time. And this photo that you see shows the old brick courthouse and Lake Eola in the background. And the trees that you see are most likely the orange groves that she purchased, where the first dairy cow produced milk for the people of downtown Orlando. And then in the 1880s, we have a cowman named Putt Myers, and he lived in downtown Orlando on Division Street. And during this time, there was a new ordinance that prohibited cows in downtown streets. I don't know if you remember the Yates family photos. I don't know if they had anything to do with that ordinance, but they were bringing cows into the downtown streets, so potentially. Putt Myers offered a cow sitting service where he would pick up people's cows and take them to graze. And one of his favorite spots to take them to graze was Lake Cherokee. And then he would have them returned by supper. And he would herd up about 100 cows daily. So here's a photo of Lake Cherokee around 1915. And whenever you visit Cherokee Park today, you just know that there is a cowboy history or cowman history there over 100 years old. And in just a few short years, family dairies started to pop up all around Orlando. At one point, there was over 70 dairies here, and one just so happened to be on Lake Cherokee. This dairy belonged to the family of Mr. and Mrs. Vivian. They were Irish descendants, and they found themselves moving around quite a bit, from Canada to Ocoee to Apopka, and finally, after the 1895 freeze, they moved to Orlando. Their first home was on Lake Dot, and then he built a home and dairy farm on Lake Cherokee on Euclid Avenue, which is in that red rectangle up there. And then his cows grazed on pasture land, which now is the subdivision known as Lancaster Park, which is in that red square. So dairies were an important part of Orlando because of the city's proximity to the tourism industry. Hotels needed fresh milk, butter, and cheese, and also the residents who didn't have a dairy cow also needed these items. So the early owners of Orlando's dairy, they probably thought that they struck gold by importing these cows to Florida. And here on the slide, we have a newspaper clipping from 1911 saying that there is a milking contest at the Orange County Fair this coming winter, where you can go against Isa Robinson, the esteemed milking champion of Orlando, who works for Lambert and Vivian Dairy. And finally, one of my favorite ads that I saw from this dairy dates back to 1918, and I'll just read one of the sentences. It's my favorite sentence from this ad. "We must get some milk at once. Arranging for the milk and cream is one of the most important things that we have to do. It is very urgent to get this milk and cream for their party." I love that. So at the time, again, there were lots of dairies run by families in Orlando who would sell products to their neighbors, but that all changed in 1916 by Burton Clarence Datsun, who I will just refer to as BC from now on, because that's quite a long name. So in 1915, BC moved his large family from Las Tunas, Cuba, where his family raised cattle between 1904 and 1915. And then in 1916, he opened Orlando's first commercial dairy, called Datsun Dairy, in what is now known as the Hourglass District. The original dairy was located on Hourglass Lake at the corner of Cloverlawn Avenue and Curry Ford Road. And here is a photo of the processing plant that was on West South Street. The pastures were located between Conway and Lake Conway, and the dairy began with just 9 cows, but grew to over 900 by 1937. Sadly, in 1926, the dairy's founder died in an auto accident, and dairy operations were taken over by his 4 sons and son-in-law. Despite this tragedy, the family's dairy business prospered, and the Orlando Sentinel dubbed BC the Milk King of Central Florida in the mid-1920s. The Datsun family acquired land and cows from many of the dairies around Central Florida, including 40 cows and property from Hawkeye Dairy, 1,000 acres in Osceola County, and the milk routes of the Shader Dairy in 1918. The land purchased from Hawkeye is the land in the Hourglass District that this dairy became known for. The Datsuns partnered with Hawkeye to create the Cloverleaf Milk Depot, which was located in the Elks Club across from the post office on Central Boulevard. The depot sold an assortment of dairy products from buttermilk to cottage cheese, and by 1920, they also offered lunch as well as homemade pie and donuts. Delicious. You may have noticed that much of these dairies advertise that their milk is free from illness, and that's because public concern grew about bacteria in milk, and government scrutiny began to hold dairies to a higher standard. So due to this, and the cost of equipment needed to pasteurize milk, many of the smaller dairies were unable to compete. And Datsun Dairy became the first in Central Florida to pasteurize milk, but many of the customers actually did not like this refrigerated milk because they were so used to the fresh milk from the cow. Datsun became the first dairy in Central Florida to deliver milk by motorized vehicle, and later was the first company in Florida to serve milk in single-serve paper cartons. By 1950, Datsun Dairy products reached 31 cities in 6 counties, and on August 16, 1951, the dairy was bought out by none other than Borden Company. The photo that you see of the South Street bottling plant, that was later sold to Borden. Not too far away, we have a photo from 1934 that features the Lakemont Dairy Milking Parlor. And this dairy was started by Clara Ward, who was a mom, and she wanted to find a way to provide fresh milk for her family. But soon she would discover how lucrative business could be. It was originally established in 1906 with a total of 4 cows, and originally they were milked by hand, strained, bottled, and delivered by the family. But in 1917, Carol took over the dairy and ran it for 40 years, where she installed electric milking machines and plate glass windows so that the public could watch the workings of a modern dairy. And in the late 1940s, their dairy herd numbered 200 and provided 700 gallons of milk a day. In 1952, the Wards closed their plant and sold their dairy routes to another important name in the game, T.G. Lee. Originally known by his government name of Thomas Gilbert, his legacy began in 1925. Happy 100 years of T.G. Lee. Growing up as a farm boy in Orlando, his father gifted him 20 acres of land and a family cow named Hopper with a banknote to buy another cow. In the early years, TG and his wife Elizabeth would work up to 20 hours a day, doing all of the milking, bottling, and delivering themselves. He did go by his initials because his full name would not fit on the bottle, so initials worked. And soon his business expanded door to door, and business really just took off from there. By the 1930s, T.G. Lee built the dairy's first high-tech milking parlor, which also attracted crowds who wanted to see cows milked by machines. By the 1950s, he purchased over 70 dairy businesses, and he built a new processing plant. He was known for being very generous to his workers and the community, and on their 50th anniversary, more than 1,000 people gathered at Disney to celebrate. Today, that operation, as you know, is still being run off of Bumby in the Milk District, and they also owned a pretty large farm near the Orlando International Airport, but in the 1980s, that became the Lee Vista Shopping Center. And here we have a map from 1952 that shows what he owned off of Bumby and Colonial. So now we have Colonial Plaza, but there used to be pastures there with the cows roaming around. Now, probably one of my favorite cattle ranching stories takes place in Lake Mary at a little place, hopefully not too lost to the past, Griffin Farms. Before 2018, you might remember the island of pasture that sat between I-4 and Lake Mary's downtown Central Park. And this farm was the last of a generation from Lake Mary's final remaining pioneer cattle families. Lillian Humphrey Griffin was the daughter of the Humphrey family, and she had many stories of how wild Florida was during its glory days of ranching. She was born in 1928 and was the third generation to be born in Seminole County. Her great-grandfather moved to Fort Reed, which was south of Sanford, in 1866, and within a few years, her great-grandfather, Mac, was well established in the cattle business here. He registered his first brand in 1869 and was just the second resident of Orange County to do so. And as we mentioned, in those days, there were no fence laws, so that meant that cow hunting was quite a legendary practice, and free-range cattle spread throughout the region. And so the Humphrey boys, they would round up these scattered herds on their little cracker horses, pushing them through the creeks and the palmetto thickets throughout Seminole, Volusia, Orange, Brevard, and even into Kissimmee River Valley. And her family did herd cattle along that legendary cracker trail that we saw earlier to the markets. And in those early days, they were paid about $13 a head in Spanish gold doubloons. Yes, a lot of the people who would ride to the markets would get paid in Spanish gold doubloons, which was fine in Orlando during that, or in Florida during that time, but outside of Florida, they didn't really work too well. The Humphrey family was once one of the largest cattle dealers in Florida and supplied a majority of the beef to the Sanford market, which was about 35 cows a week. And this legacy was then passed down to Lillian Humphrey Griffin, where she ranched in Lake Mary until 2011 on that 45-acre parcel, and that nurtured thousands of stories of her youth growing up. Now, just outside of incorporated Orlando, there's an iconic town with a really big backstory. Eatonville was incorporated in 1887 by 27 African-American men and became the first African-American town incorporated into the U.S. And in 1899, the Robert Hungerford Normal and Industrial School is established on donated land after Black leaders of the town petitioned Booker T. Washington to assist them in starting a school. And this school really became a backbone of the community and amassed quite a bit of property. And during World War II, the school increased to about 400 acres, with its farm curriculum really being emphasized as this important part of the program. So the school dedicated 365 acres for this farm operation, which included grazing land for the cattle, an orange grove, a really large chicken yard, and a sports complex. While I couldn't find a single well-documented cattle rancher from Eatonville during this period. I believe that the Hungerford School itself tells a really powerful story and boasts a wide-ranging curriculum that emphasized a lot of independence and land-based knowledge, community care. And in the context of Florida's cattle history, the school's program is a vital reminder that a lot of agricultural work, especially among Black Floridians, was not just about labor, but about learning, self-determination, and shaping the future. Really reflects how cattle and farming have been central to people's lives in Central Florida, even if not always through like the lens of commercial farming. And while Hungerford School represents collective agricultural education, just south of Orange County in rural Osceola, we find the story of an extraordinary individual, Lawrence Silas. He was born on November 8th of 1891, and their family lived in a very isolated and rural area. And in true pioneering spirit, his dad built a school and hired a teacher so that his children could receive an education. But at about 14 years old, his father passed away, and so Lawrence inherited and managed his family's 160-acre estate. He quickly proved himself not just as a rancher, but as a cattleman of remarkable skill. And he also had an almost uncanny ability to diagnose a cattle illness and could count a herd accurately just by watching them pass. And he was known for also being able to match every cow to her calf based on nothing more than the curl in the hair or the shade of their color. His talents and persona caught the attention of none other than Zora Neale Hurston, who featured him in her 1942 Saturday Evening Post article titled Lawrence of the River that we have up here. In it, Lawrence famously said that, "I will be a cowman as long as I live. I might even die out on the range with a cigar in my mouth. Wouldn't be nothing wrong with that." And nearly true to his word, the day that he suffered a stroke, he had spent his morning herding cattle. He was recognized in his lifetime by cattlemen's associations, Black educators, and even received honors from President Harry S. Truman and First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt. And he passed away on July 16th of 1974. But his legacy as a cowman still continues to inspire. And on January 6, 1927, another infamous cattleman was born, Claude Ernest Woodruff Jr., also known as Coach Woodruff. So he wore a lot of hats throughout his life, but became known fondly as Coach from his time coaching at Jones High School and Winter Park High School. But he was a member of the Kissimmee Valley Livestock Show and Fair for 10 years and the Osceola Cattlemen Association for 15 years. And he did have two daughters, Edith and Conchita, who were the first two Black children to show cattle at 4-H competitions in Florida. So I pulled this really awesome newspaper article that features Edith and her cow King. So in this photo, you have this 925-pound steer and 12-year-old Edith. So cattle has created a lot of industries here in Florida, as we've seen, and clubs such as the Future Farmers of America or the 4-H Club teach young kids many tasks beneficial to farm life, such as looking after their cattle. And she does admit in the article that she would much rather spend time roller skating with her friends, but she has a responsibility to King. She has to feed him every day his 16 pounds of food. She has to brush him, walk him, and sometimes having to pull him on a leash because he can be a little moody. Next up, we have E.L. Buster Kenton, who was born in 1920 and was raised in Kissimmee, Florida, but steeped in Florida cattle culture from a really young age. He served in World War II with the Army Air Corps, and then after that pursued art at the Ringling School of Art and Island City School of Art. And his work spans paintings, illustrations, cartoons, leather carvings, and caricatures. And in 1948, he created Cowboy Jake for the Kissimmee Jaycees. And this figure became so beloved and welcomed visitors on billboards, and it eventually evolved into Cowboy Jake, Osceola High School's mascot. This mascot was designed after another famous name in the game, Pete Clemens, who is the son of Oscar Clemens and Teresa Bronson Clemens. So his art has been widely published and appearing in Florida Cattleman magazine, Silver Spurs Rodeo News, and a lot of international agricultural magazines. As we move into this next section, I want to highlight this poem written by Moses Jumper Jr., who is a third-generation Seminole cowboy and poet laureate of the Seminole tribe. He did pass away on May 5th of this year, but his words, they ride with us as we share stories of grit, heritage, and community. And if you are attending in person, there is a printout of this poem on the table that you can take with you so you can get to see it better. I know the words are really tiny up here on the screen. But this poem is a tribute to the oldest cattle operation in North America, led by the Seminole tribe, who maintained the herds left by the Spanish in the 1500s. And it remembers a lot of the real cattlemen who drove cattle long before fences and pavement, like Charlie Miko, Naha Tiger, Josiah Johns, Big Morgan Smith, Samson Dixon, and many, many more, whose legacies live on with their families and the land. And you can read this poem and learn more about the Seminole cowkeepers in a book called Cowkeeper's Legacy, A Seminole Story. Lots of great information in there. And the Seminole people, they have always worked their way, cattle in their way in line with their values. And the tribe and their ancestors have a matrilineal and clan-based culture. So Seminole women have always held important roles in cattle ranching. And this legacy would be carried on into the 20th century by women such as Ada Tiger. She was one of the last traditional cattle ranchers and independent cattle owners among the Seminole. And she maintained her cattle on her own, her only aid coming from 2 dogs that she raised and trained as her cow chasers. She had no fences or pens to keep her herd contained. Instead, she kept them well fed with corn that was grown by her family and worked the area around the camp to ensure that her cows were really happy and would want to remain in that camp. Ada had become a cattle woman in unfortunate circumstances. Her herd was inherited from her 3 brothers who passed away between 1914 and 1919. So she took on the job of managing the family stock, and by the mid-1920s, her herd was one of the largest owned by any Seminole. And twice a year, she would walk into the market at Indiantown, Florida, leading her herd of cattle. And in town, she would sell some of the cattle and have the rest treated for ticks and fleas, buy some essential goods, and then walk her herd the 10-mile trip back home next to Lake Okeechobee. And she eventually gave birth to her daughter, who is another iconic figure in Florida's history, Betty May Tiger Jumper. And Betty May went on to be the first and only female chairperson of the Seminole tribe of Florida. So how are Florida cowmen remembered after that smear campaign of 1895 by artist Frederick Remington? Well, as we have learned, Florida has a long and diverse cattle industry history, ranging for thousands of years, pioneered by the Seminoles and their ancestors, but also by African Americans, European Americans, and a lot of modern residents of Florida. And this industry is immortalized in pop cultures with movies like Distant Drums, which came out in 1951, featuring Gary Cooper as Captain Quincy Wyatt. And there's a whole genre of movies under the category Florida Westerns that are set during the Second Seminole War. And while these movies might be historically inaccurate for how they depict the Seminole tribe, they do offer a glimpse into Old Florida, as most are set in the Old Florida swamplands and show the cowman characters as really rugged and tough. More historically accurate is photographer Carlton Ward Jr., who photographs Florida's ranching frontier. He's an 8th-generation cattle rancher and works as a conservationist to protect 18 million acres of wildland and Florida wildlife. And some of his work can be found. He has a book that just came out called Path of the Panther, New Hope for a Wild Florida. And there's also a documentary by that same name on Disney Plus if you're interested in checking that out. And we see a lot of these Florida cowmen immortalized on these historic citrus labels, which depict talented, rugged, and tough cattlemen. Again, some of these might be a little inaccurate when we're thinking about Florida cowmen. Okay, we learned a lot about what they looked like and some of their physical characteristics. So we see that Ranger one might not be too accurate. And finally, another great display of Florida's cattle ranching history are the numerous rodeos that take place across Florida. These rodeos are multifaceted and encompass tradition and skill display, entertainment, community celebration, and it's really rooted in the working skills of the cowmen and women who showcase their abilities in riding, roping, and handling livestock. And rodeos have evolved a lot over time from practical ranch tasks into competitive spectacles that celebrate the heritage of Florida's wild cattle and ranching frontier. So now that we have talked about the history of Florida's cattle ranching industry, I hope that you do not let that smear campaign of 1895 sway your view of our cattlemen and women. Florida is truly a wild frontier full of scrub and alligators, mosquitoes, panthers, and more. And our cattle ranchers, they are working hard to protect their herds and to make an effort to protect wild Florida. So thank you guys so much for joining me today. And if we have any questions, we can open the floor up for some questions. Any online questions? No? Awesome. Thank you. We have one back here. I'm so sorry. Oh, yes. Okay. So for our online audience, someone mentioned the Yarbroughs in Seminole County. And the one thing I did forget to mention, this disclaimer, I really had to control myself. At one point, this lecture was a lot longer because turns out there's a lot of people that owned cows and did cow work. But yeah, there's a lot of really iconic figures that I didn't get to put into this lunch and learn. And so maybe we'll have to have a Cowman part 2 because there are still so many more that deserve their highlight and spotlight. Thank you. Well, thank you all for joining us today. I really hope that you enjoyed today's program, and supporting our programming is one of the best ways to support the History Center. So we really appreciate you being here today. And if you want to learn more about how you can support us and get involved, or you just want to take a look at what we have going on, you can visit us at thehistorycenter.org or